You've felt it, haven't you? That subtle shift in the air between you and your partner. The conversations that used to flow effortlessly now feel like work. The warmth that once filled the space between you has been replaced by something colder, something harder to name. They're not angry. They're not fighting with you. They're just distant. And that distance, that quiet withdrawal, can feel more painful than any argument ever could. Because at least in a fight, there's presence. There's engagement. But this feels like watching someone you love slowly fade into the background of their own life, and you're left standing there, wondering what you did wrong. Wondering if you're losing them. Wondering if you've already lost them and just don't know it yet. Here's what most people don't understand about emotional distance in relationships. We tend to think that when our partner pulls away, it's because they've stopped loving us. We assume there's someone else, or that we've done something unforgivable, or that the relationship has simply run its course. And while those things can be true, they're rarely the whole story. More often than not, when your partner becomes distant, it's not about you at all. Or rather, it's not about you in the way you think it is. The real reason your partner is becoming distant has less to do with what's happening between you, and more to do with what's happening inside them. It's about a fundamental human response to feeling overwhelmed, unheard, or emotionally unsafe. It's about protection mechanisms that kick in long before we're conscious of them. And if you want to understand what's really going on, if you want any chance of bridging that gap, you need to understand the psychology behind withdrawal. Because once you see it clearly, everything changes. Let's start with something most people find uncomfortable to admit. Human beings are not naturally good at maintaining emotional intimacy over long periods of time. We like to think we are. We romanticize the idea of effortless connection, of soulmates who just understand each other without trying. But the reality is that intimacy requires constant emotional labor, constant vulnerability, and constant willingness to be seen in our messiest, most unpolished states. And that's exhausting. Not in a bad way necessarily, but exhausting nonetheless. When we first fall in love, we're running on adrenaline and dopamine. The brain is flooded with feel-good chemicals that make vulnerability feel easy, even thrilling. But as relationships mature and settle into routine, those chemical highs fade. What's left is the actual work of intimacy. And for many people, that work starts to feel heavy. Not because they don't love their partner, but because they're already carrying so much else. Think about it this way. Your partner wakes up every day with a finite amount of emotional energy. They have work stress, family obligations, financial worries, health concerns, existential anxieties about the state of the world. They're managing 100 tiny disappointments and frustrations that they may never voice. They're holding themselves together in ways you might never see. And then they come home to you, to the relationship, which is supposed to be their safe space, their refuge. But here's the paradox. The people we love most are also the people who can hurt us most deeply. The relationship that's supposed to feel like rest can sometimes feel like yet another place where they need to perform, to manage, to get it right. And when that happens, when the relationship starts to feel like one more thing on an already overwhelming list, the instinct isn't to lean in and communicate. The instinct is to withdraw, to create distance, to protect what little energy they have left. This withdrawal isn't usually conscious or intentional. Your partner probably isn't sitting there thinking about how to hurt you or push you away. In fact, they may not even fully realize they're doing it. Emotional distance often happens gradually, almost imperceptibly. It starts with small things. They stop sharing the little details of their day. They spend more time on their phone or absorbed in distractions. They respond to your attempts at connection with distracted nods or one-word answers. They're physically present but emotionally absent. And the cruel irony is that the more you try to close that gap, the more you ask what's wrong or try to force conversation, the further they retreat. Because in their overwhelmed state, your need for connection feels like pressure. It feels like one more demand on their already depleted reserves. Now let's talk about what's really happening in the brain when someone withdraws emotionally. There's a concept in psychology called the window of tolerance. It refers to the zone of arousal in which we can function optimally. When we're within our window of tolerance, we can handle stress, process emotions, and engage meaningfully with others. But when something pushes us outside that window, we move into either hyperarousal, which looks like anxiety, panic, or anger, or hypoarousal, which looks like shutdown, numbness, or withdrawal. When your partner becomes distant, they've likely moved into hypoarousal. Their nervous system has essentially said, this is too much, I need to shut down to protect myself. And in that state, connection feels threatening rather than comforting. It's not that they don't want to connect with you. It's that their system is in survival mode, and in survival mode, vulnerability feels dangerous. This is especially true if your partner has any history of emotional neglect, trauma, or insecure attachment. People who grew up in environments where their emotions were dismissed, criticized, or ignored often develop a deeply ingrained belief that expressing needs or being vulnerable will lead to rejection or hurt. So they learn to cope by withdrawing, by handling everything on their own, by never asking for too much. And when adult relationships hit rough patches or stressful periods, that old programming kicks back in. They retreat into self-sufficiency. They convince themselves they're fine alone. They create distance not because they don't love you, but because somewhere deep in their nervous system, closeness and pain are wired together. Getting close means risking being hurt. And if they're already feeling fragile or overwhelmed, that risk feels too great. But there's another layer to this that people rarely talk about. Sometimes your partner becomes distant not because they're overwhelmed by life outside the relationship, but because they're overwhelmed by something inside the relationship itself. And this is the part that's hard to hear. Sometimes the distance is a response to feeling unseen, unheard, or emotionally unsafe with you. Not because you're a bad partner, but because somewhere along the way, communication broke down. Maybe they tried to tell you something was wrong, and it didn't land. Maybe they expressed a need, and it was dismissed or minimized. Maybe they showed vulnerability, and it was met with criticism or defensiveness. And after enough of those experiences, they stopped trying. They learned that bringing things up doesn't help, so they started keeping things in. They learned that conflict feels bad and goes nowhere, so they started avoiding it. And slowly, quietly, they began to protect themselves by pulling away. This pattern is incredibly common in long-term relationships, and it's devastating because both people usually feel like the victim. The person who's withdrawn feels unheard and unsupported, convinced that their partner doesn't really care or won't understand. The person being withdrawn from feels abandoned and confused, convinced that their partner has stopped loving them or is pushing them away for no reason. And both people are stuck in a cycle where neither feels safe enough to truly open up. The withdrawn partner can't be vulnerable because it hasn't felt safe in the past. The pursuing partner can't stop pursuing because the distance feels like rejection, and rejection triggers panic. And round it goes, with each person's protective behavior triggering the other's protective behavior, until the space between them feels uncrossable. There's also a phenomenon that happens in relationships that psychologists call differentiation. As relationships deepen and we spend more time together, there's a natural tension between maintaining our individual sense of self and being part of a couple. Some people respond to this tension by merging, by trying to become as close as possible to their partner, sometimes to the point of losing themselves. Other people respond by creating distance, by reasserting their independence and autonomy. And often, you'll have one partner who leans toward merging and one who leans toward separating, which creates a dynamic where the more one pursues, the more the other withdraws. The withdrawing partner isn't necessarily pulling away because they don't love their partner. They're pulling away because they need space to remember who they are as an individual. They need room to breathe, to have their own thoughts and feelings, to not feel consumed by the relationship. But to the pursuing partner, this feels like abandonment. It feels like rejection. And so they pursue harder, which makes the withdrawing partner need even more space, and the cycle intensifies. What makes this particularly painful is that both needs are legitimate. The need for closeness and the need for space are both valid human needs. But in relationships, we rarely talk about these needs explicitly. We expect our partners to just know. We expect them to read our minds, to understand what we need without us having to say it. And when they don't, when they give us what they need instead of what we need, we interpret it as a lack of love or care. But most of the time, it's not about love at all. It's about two people with different nervous systems, different attachment styles, different ways of managing stress and emotion, trying to navigate intimacy together without a clear map. Here's another truth that's difficult to sit with. Sometimes distance grows in relationships simply because we stop doing the things that created closeness in the first place. In the beginning, we were curious about each other. We asked questions. We listened deeply. We made time for long conversations and shared experiences. We were generous with our attention and affection. But as life gets busy and the relationship becomes familiar, we stop putting in that effort. We assume closeness will maintain itself. We take each other for granted. We stop being curious and start making assumptions. We stop really listening and start waiting for our turn to talk. We stop seeing our partner as a complex, evolving person and start seeing them as a fixed character in the story of our life. And when that happens, when we stop actively choosing each other and nurturing the connection, distance is inevitable. Not because anyone did anything wrong, but because intimacy is not a destination. It's a practice. And like any practice, if we stop doing it, we lose it. There's also the reality that sometimes distance is a response to disappointment. Not necessarily a dramatic disappointment, but the slow accumulation of small letdowns over time. The plans that kept getting canceled. The conversations that never went deep enough. The ways you imagined your partner showing up that they never quite managed. The life you thought you'd build together that looks different from what you're actually living. And none of these disappointments alone is enough to end a relationship. But together, over time, they create a kind of resignation. A quiet giving up. Your partner stops expecting as much from you, from the relationship, from love itself. They lower their expectations as a way of protecting their heart. And that emotional self-protection looks a lot like distance. They're not leaving. They're just not letting themselves hope or want too much anymore. Because hoping and wanting has hurt too many times. And then there's the possibility that your partner is going through something internal that has nothing to do with the relationship at all. Depression, anxiety, burnout, grief, identity crisis, hormonal changes, health issues. Any of these can cause someone to turn inward and become distant. When people are struggling internally, they often lack the emotional bandwidth to maintain connection with others. It's not that they don't care. It's that they're using every ounce of energy just to get through the day. They're in survival mode, and in survival mode, relationships feel like a luxury they can't afford. They withdraw not because they want to be alone, but because they don't have anything left to give. And the tragedy is that this is often when they need support most, but they're least able to ask for it or receive it. What all of these scenarios have in common is that distance in relationships is rarely about what it appears to be on the surface. It's rarely as simple as they don't love me anymore or they're losing interest. More often, it's about protection. It's about overwhelm. It's about unmet needs or unexpressed pain or old wounds being triggered. It's about two people trying to take care of themselves in ways that inadvertently hurt each other. And the only way through it is to stop making assumptions about what the distance means and start getting curious about what's really happening. Not from a place of accusation or desperation, but from genuine care and willingness to understand. So where does that leave you? Sitting with the ache of distance, the confusion of not knowing what's happening in the person you love. It's one of the most painful positions to be in, because you can't force someone to come closer. You can't logic them out of their withdrawal. You can't love them hard enough to pull them back if they're not ready to return. But what you can do is understand that their distance is not a statement about your worth or the relationship's worth. It's information. It's a signal that something needs attention, that something has become too much or not enough, that somewhere in the complexity of two lives trying to intertwine, something has gone off course. The truth about relationships that no one likes to admit is that they're not meant to be easy. They're meant to be growth. They're meant to show us our edges, our fears, our unhealed places. They're meant to challenge us to communicate better, to be more vulnerable, to see beyond our own perspective. And sometimes the distance that feels like an ending is actually an invitation. An invitation to have the hard conversation. An invitation to look at your own patterns and behaviors. An invitation to create the kind of safety where both people can be honest about what they need. An invitation to rebuild connection with more awareness and intention than before. Your partner's distance may be telling you that something needs to change. Maybe it's about how you communicate conflict. Maybe it's about how you balance closeness and independence. Maybe it's about old hurts that need to be named and healed. Maybe it's about life circumstances that need to shift. Or maybe it's simply about remembering to choose each other again, to be curious again, to do the small daily things that say you matter to me, I see you, I'm here. Because at the end of the day, that's what intimacy really is. Not the absence of distance, but the willingness to keep showing up, to keep trying to understand, to keep believing that the person across from you is doing the best they can with what they have. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is give them space to figure out what they need, while also being clear about what you need. Not as an ultimatum, but as an act of honesty. Because real love isn't about holding on so tight that no one can breathe. It's about creating enough safety that both people can be fully themselves, fully alive, fully present. And if you can do that, if you can meet the distance with curiosity instead of fear, with compassion instead of blame, then maybe, just maybe, you'll find your way back to each other. Not to the relationship you had before, but to something deeper, something more real. Something built not on assumption and expectation, but on truth and choice. And that's worth the discomfort of not knowing. That's worth the vulnerability of asking. That's worth everything.